You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. And we will be doing lots of politics and public policy this evening, which is a little different show this evening. We're going to start out with a little bit about the governor's race. Then we're going to take you to a discussion that I had with State Senator Kwame Raoul. It's actually the second part of a discussion. We'll go into that more later. But jumping right into the governor's race, we're taping this show on October 22nd. 2014, so it's just about 2 weeks before the election on November 4th, and we hope you get to see this before the election. For some of you folks, it might be just the day before, some perhaps a little bit more. But in any case, we're not endorsing, we're not promoting a candidate, we're not promoting a party. I wanted to focus on the governor's race and just talk a little bit about the issues. If it sounds like we're favoring one or the other, we're really not. I'm just trying to give a clear discussion of the issues which may have been missed during the governor's race for various reasons. So let me start with that. The main things I think we're talking about, the main issues in the governor's race, of course, taxes and spending, state taxes, state spending, education, Medicaid, which is healthcare spending, and pensions. The drivers, the main aspects of the budget, the general revenue budget for the state of Illinois is about $36 billion, I believe, give or take a few. But the main drivers of that budget are obviously education, K through 12 education, and also higher education, but mostly K through 12 is the bulk of that education spending. Medicaid is a big driver. Taking care of health care for relatively low-income people. Some say now we've expanded into middle-income or middle-class people. And then pensions for the state employees, pensions for many teachers. Those state employee pensions, including the teachers and some others, a major part of the spending. It's now and with health care, it's about almost a quarter of the spending of the current budget. So those are the three things. Of course, there are other items in the budget, and that's why a lot of attention has been given to those items, rightfully so, in the discussion of the governor's race. Perhaps mostly on education, and there should have been more perhaps, and on pensions, perhaps more on Medicaid. And in addition to the spending on that, obviously jobs are important, the economy, the unemployment rate in Illinois, whether the unemployment rate truly measures that. Jobs. So these are the key, what we call the kitchen table issues. Voters sit around, they discuss these issues at their kitchen table, and those discussions and those views and those opinions presumably have a tremendous impact on the votes. And so we get to Bruce Rauner, who's the Republican nominee, and we get to Pat Quinn, the Democratic candidate for re-election. Pat's been there for 6 years. And if we try to compare these two in a cool, dispassionate way, what comes to mind when you think of Pat Quinn? Well, he's been there, as we say, for 6 years. He came in on rough times, replacing Rod Blagojevich after he was arrested and or impeached, whatever. I guess impeached first, and then he was arrested after. So I guess that's when Quinn came in 2008, after Blagojevich was impeached and removed by the state Senate, and then subsequently he was arrested. So those were tough times. Pat Quinn came on under difficult circumstances. What will Pat do if he's elected or re-elected? I think we have to say he'd be more likely between the two to increase spending. He's more likely between the two to keep taxes higher than Rauner would. Most people know that the taxes were increased, income taxes were increased in 2010. That was supported by Pat Quinn. I think it was supported even when he was running before the election, and they were raised after the election, which he won in 2010. A significant increase from 3%, with some exemptions, but pretty much 3% of your income to 5% of your income if you're a voter and a resident here in the state of Illinois and a earner. And that accounts for $6 or $7 billion a year additional revenue. So it's almost $30 billion in the last 4 years. And Pat says that's necessary because that law was passed so that there would be a sunsetting, a partial sunsetting, so that taxes, if nothing else is done, as of this time in the last part of 2014 or in 2015. If nothing else is done, in January 2015, those taxes, your taxes, will go back or decrease from 5%, not to the prior rate, not all the way to the prior rate, but to 3.75%. And Pat says that's going to lose a lot of revenue, so although initially he said it was a temporary increase in the tax, he now says it has to stay there. Rauner says he wants to, it's a little unclear, but I think the best indication of what Mr. Rauner wants, if he gets elected, is to have a staggered reduction. Don't go immediately from 5 to 3.75, but go gradually, maybe over 4 years from 5 to 3.75, maybe sooner. We're not too clear on that. Maybe he wants to take us all the way back from 5 to 3.5% to 3% eventually. But the short of it, whatever happens, folks, because things may not go directly, as I've said, I think you can bet that Mr. Quinn is more likely to raise your taxes or keep taxes higher than Mr. Rauner. That's what they're saying, and that's what they're likely to do. And correspondingly, spending will be higher under Quinn and lower under Rauner if the revenue and resources are lower. That's taxes, that's spending. Let's go to education. Well, Rauner accuses Quinn of cutting spending and education while he's governor. Quinn says he didn't. It doesn't really matter so much. Looking ahead, actually Rauner says he wants to increase spending on education. Quinn says he wants to increase spending on education. And Rauner talks about reforming education, school choice, school vouchers, charter schools, as a way to make schools more efficient. Quinn is interesting because at times he said, while a governor, he said that he favored charter schools. He's picked as his running mate Paul Vallis. Nobody's focused on this, but Paul told me, he's been on this show a number of times. He said, from 2002, 2001, when he was running for governor, to 2010, 2012, when I last had conversations with him, he's always, he said, favored school choice, school vouchers, charter schools. And that's his running mate. That's Quinn's running mate. So there's some difference there. But in short, I think you'd have to say, historically and based on current statements, Rauner's more likely to reform education by infusing some school choice, giving people more of an opportunity to opt out of traditional neighborhood public schools, or we could say public, out of traditional neighborhood schools where you go to school simply where you live. You don't have a choice. You may be able to go to school where you live to a different school. A charter school is a public school. Charter school can be in your neighborhood. A voucher school can be in your neighborhood. But Rauner's a believer in that choice. He's a believer in competition. He's a believer that competition should work as well in education as in other areas. Quinn, not so much. As I say, I'm simplifying here because these issues are complicated, complex, and the candidates themselves talk about these issues differently at different times. Medicaid, well, that's a major chunk of the budget. They haven't spent a lot of time talking about it. I think they both want to reform it. Quinn says he has reformed it. Rauner said he would reform it more, bring in experts to study that. It's kind of a wash between these two. I think they both want to do things. I think Rauner's more likely to have serious reform. Some are scared by that. Some are encouraged. Quinn, some reform, but not as much. Whether spending would be much less or much more under either, I doubt there's really a lot of difference between those two as to that. Perhaps somewhat less spending under Rauner. Pensions. Rauner says he doesn't want to take anybody's benefits away if they've worked and they've earned it. He didn't support the pension reform bill that some would say did that. Quinn did say support the pension reform bill. As I said, some would say that took things away. And now the state Supreme Court, through other decisions, has signaled it's likely to hold the pension reform bill that was passed unconstitutional. So somebody's going to the legislature and the governor in 2015 are really likely to have to do something differently on pension reform than was done in the pension reform bill. Rauner says he favors a defined contribution plan as opposed to defined benefits. Quinn wants to stick with the defined benefit. That is the major difference between the two. 80% of the private sector has switched, has gone to defined contributions as opposed to defined benefits. Why shouldn't the state governor of Illinois and all state governments? Why? Nobody's really answered that question well, and Mr. Quinn hasn't answered that question well when I and others have asked him. But that's the major difference. If you think we have to go to a defined contribution plan as opposed to stick with a defined benefit plan, well, I think Rauner's your guy. If you want to stick with a defined benefit plan, well, then Quinn's your guy. So, in short, and most of the campaign has been about these negative ads. For Rauner, it's been Quinn hitting Rauner on his company, GTCR. They invested in a number of companies. Rauner says they've done very well, and they probably have. And he's invested pensions for various people, including government workers. He said he's done those good investments in his and other companies. He's got hit because some of those companies were companies providing Medicare services. Some of those companies have been sued. There have been allegations of improper, inadequate care by those companies in terms of providing Medicare services. Quinn has hit hard on that. Should that be a major issue relative to all the discussion, all the items I've enumerated? I don't think so. I think Rauner's shown he's a successful business guy. Some of those companies were not run well. Some had some executives who probably weren't the best. Should Rauner be successful? Should he be held accountable if he invested in his company did in 1,200 companies and 10 didn't do so well or 10 did things that were wrong? I don't think so. On the other hand, Quinn's been hit hard by Rauner for IDOT, for patronage, for corruption there. He's been really hit hard for associating with Blagojevich before, and Blagojevich ended up going to jail. So Rauner hits him on that. He hits him for association as a Democrat with Speaker Mike Madigan. He says if you want to reform things, you've got to change. Well, there's something to it, but look, I'd take both of those things away and say, look at the issues. Look at the issues that I've discussed. Who are you closer to, Rauner or Quinn? Based on that issue discussion, I think that's where you decide how to vote. That's my thinking. In any case, what you should do now is watch the remainder of the show. That's with State Senator Kwame Raoul and Jeff Berkowitz. We're discussing criminal justice. If you want to see, and I think it's useful to see how these issues can be discussed on a high level. They really can. And we had a thoughtful discussion with I'm providing another point of view. Sometimes it's my true view, sometimes it may not, but that's how we achieve balance on the show. We bring the guest on and we give the other point of view through your host. If you want to see us discussing education and school choice, go to youtube.com/Public Affairs TV, and you can see the first part of that show. So hope you enjoyed the discussion. Hope you enjoyed the discussion with State Senator Kwame Raoul. If you haven't voted, vote on November 4th. If you haven't voted in terms of early voting, and come back next week and every week to Public Affairs. So we've been putting our heart and soul into school choice and vouchers and education, and that's an important issue. But when we think of the key issues here for the state, and certainly for the area you represent in Chicago, education is key. And second, maybe first, is violence and safety. I mean, when you're talking about New Trier, one thing they don't have is a major safety problem. Around here, look, I lived in Hyde Park for a long time. I know there's safe parts of Hyde Park. There are less safe. Right. You, my friend, happen to live in a little less safe area than I lived in. And so you have my admiration there. You didn't really flee. You could have gone, I won't say where you live, probably just shouldn't go into, but you could have fled a pretty relatively unsafe area and made it much safer, but you didn't. You stuck it out. You're a guy who's committed to a lot of things. But the main thing for people to know about this is what should be done, because as I've said to State Representative Christian Mitchell, we need to do something now, because as I said to him, and I don't know if he's saying I'm demagoguing, but people are dying. Kids are dying. Kids are going to a slumber party on the south side of Chicago or in Inglewood or in Hyde Park even, and they're not making it through the night. They're getting shot at a slumber party, 9, 10, 11-year-old kids. That shouldn't happen.
Agreed. I mean, it's.
How do we stop that now? Because as I've said to Christian Mitchell, Barack Obama, as you know, he quoted Dr. Martin Luther King, and he said the fierce urgency of now. Now. So using that from Dr. Martin Luther King, the fierce urgency of now, how do you stop those killings now? Not 5 years later, not 2 years later, but now, October 10th, 2010.
I think
October 10th, 2014.
I share the urgency of now, and you and I have had this conversation off the record, and there's much I agree with. I mean, I think that there's got to be consequence for people who are preying on these communities and preying on these children, and
by consequence, you mean what?
That we need to get those people off of the streets. That they need to be prosecuted and they need to be put in prison.
For how long? For how long, Kwame? What's just if you've taken a gun that you shouldn't have had and you killed some kid?
What's just depends on the circumstances, as you know.
Should there be a minimum and a max? Should there be a range? Tell me. Yeah, there is the range. What is the range?
There are a range. I can't tell you exactly what the range.
What would you do? Give me what you think might be a just range.
I can tell you what we're doing right now.
2 years? Would it be okay if somebody went to jail for 2 years and then they were out after killing somebody?
We'll see.
Would there ever be a case where that's okay?
For killing someone?
Yeah. Some guy had a gun. He meant to shoot at another gang member, and some innocent kid got in between, and he was 9 years old, and he got killed.
No, I think 2 years would not be sufficient.
5 years, would that be sufficient?
That. You're asking me.
Come on, you're a state senator. You're making laws.
Jeff, if I'm going to do this, we're going to have a conversation, right? You're asking me, and this is the problem with absolute mandatories. You're asking me to make a judgment on a case without enough specifics about a case. As you know, as you should know, if you haven't, I mean, I've actually practiced.
I know there's some exceptions.
There's a reason.
So
what we do with our criminal code and what every state in the United States of America does, they give a range of where a judge who listens to all of the factors in the case, both in the case prior to the determination of the trier of fact and in the sentencing process, they listen to all the evidence and they make a determination based on that. So you can throw out a brief snippet of a hypothetical. It doesn't make sense for me to say what should be the exact sentence for that. And that's a problem with policymaking, quite frankly, and I'm glad you did it because you have a lot of people, lay people who are unfamiliar with the criminal justice system.
But my point is we're doing it your way.
Reactionary.
We're doing it your way.
What are you saying is my way?
Your way is to have people study this and have a range and have the law codify that range and have judges have a lot of discretion.
That's not my way. That's
the way you're recommending.
That's the way.
That's the status quo. That is the way we do it.
That's the way every state in the United States does it.
Not every state.
They don't have a range?
Some states have what's called mandatory sentencing. Some cities have.
They have a mandatory minimum, right? That doesn't say what the maximum is.
No, but I'm asking.
So what does that mean? If you have a minimum,
do you support mandatory minimums? Do you support mandatory minimums?
No, I don't.
Okay,
but let me finish. But you said it's not a range. I said every state does a range. When you have a minimum, what else do you have? You have a maximum. And what's in between the minimum and the maximum? A range.
Well, how about having a mandatory minimum? How about having a mandatory minimum with? And here I'll throw something in that I didn't have in our discussion.
Because you know what I was going to bring up.
And we have a mandatory minimum with the idea that when exceptional circumstances can be demonstrated to a judge in a public court with due process, then with those exceptional circumstances, you have a hearing and the judge or a jury can listen to that matter, can listen to arguments on both sides, and go below the minimum. We do that kind of thing.
I'm fine with that, but that's not what you do. That's not a mandatory minimum.
That is.
It's not.
It's Jeff Berkowitz's modified mandatory minimum. Would you give me credit? Would you name that bill after me?
I'm for that. Okay. I'm for that, but that's not mandatory minimum as people describe it.
Would you go back and sponsor a law that does it? Because I don't think we have a law in the books.
But what you just defined, Jeff, fundamentally, what you just defined is just a range.
No. I set out a procedure that's going to minimize the exceptions. You can have exceptions, but I've sent out a procedure that would mean we can't have the exceptions become dominant. You go out and you write a law and you sponsor that law, and we'll call it Jeff's law. We can even call it Jeff and Kwame's law.
You put in the language, but
it's gonna
I
be,
believe
it's gonna
what
be different. Okay.
I believe what you just defined is the status quo. I mean, a
Tell
judge
people
has
out there-
discretion.
Would you just tell people out there, because these are your constituents, these are people in low-income areas, what are you doing differently as of today that says you understand people are dying and we have the fierce urgency of now? What are you doing differently that you weren't doing in the last 10 years? Because whatever we've been doing in the last 10 years, it ain't working.
What I'm doing right now as we speak, and you can invite you to come on Tuesday, I'm sitting on a joint committee of criminal justice reform where we're trying to come up with a solution. I've been meeting with the superintendent of police. I just took a ride around with the commander in my area and having discussions to try to figure out how we can craft. And I think we're not too far from one another, quite frankly, in terms of. I don't think.
When is this going to get done? When is this new law going to get done, Kwame? I want you to announce it on my show, and we'll come back and talk to you and say,
I don't do that, and I
think you ought to. You have to be held accountable. But you have to be held.
But setting,
you said now.
Setting an arbitrary, and I'm glad you said when is it going to be done. Setting arbitrary deadlines is the same thing that and it's something I knocked the governor on. So you know that I'm willing to do.
Call it a goal.
The governor said last year July 9th. It has to be done July 9th when it wasn't practical.
What had to be done by July 9th?
The pension reform bill that we had just started a conference.
Can we call it a goal? Would you be okay if we set a goal and say this is our goal to have it done by that date? Isn't it a good idea to have goals?
It is a good. I mean, my goal would be to have had it done last
Set a realistic
June.
goal, and if it's not done by then, I'm going to be asking you why. What's a realistic goal?
What
for
is
you to
the
come
it
up
exactly?
A major change in the criminal laws that people can expect will reduce significantly the number of murders. You know, when we had like 80 shootings a few months ago, we had 10 people.
So
that's not going to happen
I've
anymore.
spent a lot of time.
That's what your
I've
effort.
spent a lot of time looking at criminal justice policy, and I don't do things in isolation. And when I say spend time, I've gone throughout the country meeting with experts on this.
We only have a minute or two left, so I'm going to let you talk. You just keep going.
I'm glad you are. And so as we do this, and conservative advocates have told us to look at our criminal justice policy comprehensively. We can't just say, okay, we're going to set some policy to send more people to prison without looking at our resources. You know, I'm strangely enough, you're going to hear me say, I'm with Rand Paul, I'm with Newt Gingrich, I'm with Grover Norquist even, who said, let's look at it comprehensively, and let's look at people we may be sending to prison or keeping in prison that we're wasting our resources on.
Nonviolent offenders, you're saying. Rand Paul, a lot of libertarians have noticed this.
And let's make sure we
free up the resources to be used for the violent guys. Let the nonviolent guys go into treatment programs, other programs that does tie up a lot of resources that we need to prevent these murders from occurring.
And the critical thing to that.
When are we going to get this done?
No, this is important.
Yeah.
The because I'm just not talking sound bites here. The critical thing to that is the utilization of risk assessment tools. When you in the sentencing process, in the process when whether it's a director of Department of Corrections,
bringing all we know and all the experts know to come up with well-crafted legislation that will, we hope and we reasonably believe, significantly reduce the number of shootings and killings in the inner city. That's our goal, right?
And quite
to do that soon.
And quite
not in 2025.
But listen, you have to listen to.
I'm listening. I'm listening.
If there were 60 Kwame Raouls and 30 Kwame in the House of Representatives and 30 Kwame Raouls in the Senate, I could promise you it could be done by January.
Well, you got to work with what you got.
But the reality is, it's not just in the state of Illinois, we have a political existence where people are afraid of being characterized as soft on crime. And so the part that Newt Gingrich and Rand Paul and Grover Norquist, notwithstanding the fact that they've advocated for it, it takes a while to bring people along. It's happening.
Okay.
But I can't flip a switch. I'm going to tell you right now, I can't flip a switch and make people embrace this. They've got to educate themselves on it. I'm with you. We do need to free up resources. We do need to get the people who are preying on our children off the streets. We also need to make sure we look at how these people became these people.
That's the education side. We covered education
well, it's
earlier
not
in
just
the
education,
show.
it's mental health.
But a lot of it's education.
It's drugs. It's
a
it's
lot of it's
comprehensive.
education.
A lot of it's education.
A lot
I'm
of
with
it's
you there.
education. If you teach
But-
kids how to read, a whole new world opens.
but-
when I tell you 20% of the kids
I'm
in
with you.
fourth grade are reading at grade level in CPS, and that's mostly
I'm with you. I'm
That's
with
like
you.
a major
You know,
problem, right?
I've agreed with you on a couple of things here, so we're on
We're in
a
agreement.
stretch here.
All right,
But-
so just
but-
give me, and we'll let you go. Just one last thing. We're taping this on October 10th, 2014. What's your target date to have legislation pass that significantly revises the criminal justice system so we have these positive effects starting to occur?
I don't know.
Give me an estimate.
1
year, 2 years, 4
Let me
years?
just tell you.
You got to give me something.
Well, I'm going to give you something if you let me reply.
Yeah.
This Joint Committee on Criminal Justice Reform, I think, has set a deadline of the end of the year to come up with
The end of 2014 to come up with what?
proposals for the General Assembly at large.
Be ready to be voted on by the General Assembly?
I don't know. I think so. You know,
This fierce urgency of now is slipping away,
Yeah,
Kwame.
yeah. Well,
Kids are dying. Kids are dying.
I understand that. I understand that because they're dying.
People in New Trier
I understand
put up
that
with this for a heartbeat. They would stop it now. I want you to have that same fervency, okay? They would say, my kid's not going to have that happen. I want you to say, and your kids are at risk. I want you to, and I know you care.
And you know,
and I know you care.
And you know the way to make it happen quicker
What's the way?
is to have New Trier open up their doors so some of these kids
It's to have these
could come up
kids,
there,
let
and then
them go, let them go.
and the parents
School
from New
choice,
Trier would
school
have the
vouchers.
sense of urgency,
Milton Friedman, free to choose.
and the votes
Remember
that I
that,
would need
folks,
to
free
get
to
from
choose.
those areas of the state, I would get right away.
Okay. You and I are going to construct a great school voucher, school choice program. I'm going to sign Kwame up to this. He's going to sign me up to the criminal justice reform. We're going to do great things.
Absolutely.
Wasn't it Newt Gingrich was going around with, who was the Democrat he was going
And our voucher plan is going to have it such that all private schools have to admit anybody who's going to apply.
It's those kids in your district are going to be so much better off, Kwame. Those low-income Hispanic and black kids.
Now, I'm
Your
with our
district-
plan that all schools will have to.
I know that's an unreasonable barrier.
And then
that doesn't help anybody.
And then we're going to
We'll
just
have to-
shut down
we'll have to-
all of the
okay.
public schools, even the New Triers. We're going to shut them all down, and then we're going to just have this equal education system where any kid could go to any school.
We're going to let you go, but I think I've got a commitment to come back after the governor's election. We're going to review that and see where the state of Illinois is going once we know whether it's still Governor Pat Quinn or whether it's Governor Bruce Rauner. We'll know that. You'll be back here. I am so pleased that you and I got together because we're going to solve so much. I think we could, job sharing, we could have a state senator's office that you and I share. How's that for a novel idea?
On the south side.
I'm with you. I've been a South Sider a long time, except for being a Cubs fan. Okay. All right. I'm not going to get you into that.
Thank you so
much.
That.
Thanks so much going to State Senator Kwame Raoul for taking the time. He's a great guy. He's been a state senator for 10 years. He's a partner at Quarles and Brady. And look, ladies, he's a man about town. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.